Both the quarterback and offensive line need to step up, but right now, the Falcons' offensive line has been its biggest disappointment this season.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast. You may also know me as Mr. Drew. You may also know me as Sirius Black, Mr. Holier Than Thou. And we thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this podcast that makes this illustrious podcast your first listen. And all you got to do to follow in the footsteps of the everydayers is subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode is the All-22 review. We'll talk about the Falcons offensive line performance, the quarterback. We'll talk about the play calling and why I don't have as many questions about that. We'll talk about the sort of new look defense and if the pressure is there for the Falcons. But we'll start off today's episode talking about the news of the day, which is that the Falcons officially placed linebacker Troy Andersen on IR today, and he's presumably done for the season. And to fill his roster spot, the Falcons signed offensive tackle Storm Norton off the Saints practice squad. If you don't know Norton, he did start one season at right tackle for the Chargers as an injury replacement back in 2021. He performed very poorly that year. He ranked 84th out of 88 tackles, according to PFF, in pass protection that year. So, I don't think he's really moving the needle forward for the Falcons. The Falcons are still down bad at that swing tackle position. And when we signed Isaiah Prince a couple of weeks ago, I told you I'm not convinced that Isaiah Prince is going to last particularly long for the rest of the season in solving that problem. And, we saw Tyler Vrabel get activated off the practice squad to be the swing tackle against the Lions last week. Now they're signing Storm Norton. So it does feel like, we're moving in that direction of moving off Isaiah Prince. So hopefully this is the last time you hear Isaiah Prince and Tyler Vrabel and Storm Norton's names mentioned on this podcast, because that means Jake Matthews stayed healthy. And, I know Caleb McGarry, has gotten a lot of flack for his poor performances these first 3 weeks, deservedly so. I just want to remind you guys that I did want to move off McGarry Island this offseason, but, we had to go back, right? But, in terms of Prince and Norton, I don't know if they're better. They found that the two guys that have started games in the NFL that have been demonstrably worse than Caleb McGarry the last couple of years. So, I got to start watching tackles on Saturdays, because it seems like we're headed to using that day 2 pick on an offensive tackle. We should have done it last year, but it is what it is. So it's not the last time we talk about the offensive line on today's episode. So let's get into that All-22 review and let's talk a little bit about expectations. I know, right? And I think a lot of people's frustration over this Lions game boils down to expectations not being met. And I remember saying this to someone on Twitter on Monday night, which is, I think if you were to boil this loss down to one thing, right, that after that Jesse Bates interception, the Falcons had a chance to cut the lead to 13-10, and they needed a quarterback to make 2 throws on 3rd and 4th down of that subsequent drive to Drake London, and Desmond Ridder didn't make the throws. And, that's frustrating to a lot of folks. I'm not particularly angered or frustrated by that because, again, my expectations were not as high on Desmond Ridder going into the season. That's part of the reason why, again, I predicted the Falcons to start the season 1-3. I figured it would take some time for him to get going. I didn't have these expectations that the Falcons offense would be this super high powered attack, right? And be this top unit. I thought their ceiling as an offense would be maybe the 13th best offense in the NFL if they checked certain boxes, right? They had an elite running game. They coupled that with a very efficient 3rd down offense, top 10 there, efficient red zone offense, top 10 there, and a healthy sprinkling of explosive plays. You check those 4 boxes, this offense has the potential to reach its ceiling, which is probably an above average unit. Right. And then you couple that with a defense that just, does its job to get stops and, can get, not forcing that to play from behind and all that stuff. Right. And just be an average unit, figured they'd be like 18th or 20th best defense in the league. And that would be their formula to check those 5 boxes to be a playoff team this season. And, you look at those 5 boxes, the defense is performing about on par. They're 20th in DVOA. I know they're better in some of the more volume stats, but I think DVOA is a better reflection of defensive quality. I wish they could be a little bit more explosive, but frankly, if they probably hit that deep shot to Kyle Pitts against the Lions, we're probably not talking about this offense not being explosive enough, right? They're roughly league average, and that would put them right on pace with some of the other teams in the middle of the pack this year, that one play. And while the run game did take a major step back last week, I'm not super worried about that unit. As I mentioned the other day, like maybe I'm not as confident that they're going to be the elite dominant unit, but I still expect them to be a very good unit. So it really kind of boils down to the third down and red zone boxes aren't really getting checked. Right now, the Falcons are 27th in third down offense, 19th in red zone efficiency. So they got to get better there, right? And some of that is on the quarterback, right? Talking about the red zone stuff, like last year, Ridder has not been great when he's been asked to throw the ball into the end zone in the red zone, right? Even if you count that Mac Hollins touchdown as a catch, which it didn't count, but we'll pretend it was a catch. He'd only be 2 of 5 completing passes on throws into the red zone, into the end zone this year. And we talked last week about Arthur Smith's play calling in the red zone being very iffy in the Packers game. We'll talk more about that later. So quarterback's got to get better. Play calling's got to get better in the red zone. That should hopefully fix that issue. Third downs, Ridder hasn't been great, but when I started going deeper into the stats, it felt like it was less of a third down issue and more of an early down issue, right? That when you look at Ridder's EPA per play, expected points added on late downs, third and fourth downs, last year he was 11th out of 46 quarterbacks in the league, right? Which was significantly improved from what Marcus Mariota was, which was 38th out of 46. And Ridder isn't quite as good this year, but he's about 18th out of 34. So he's roughly average, right? Now, one of the things I noticed when I started doing more research was if you go and only look at 3rd and 7 or less, so 7 or less yards to go on third down, the Falcons' third down efficiency in terms of converting those into first downs would be 5th best on passes, just on passes, right? So when Ridder's had to throw the ball on 3rd and 7 or less, he's been able to move the chains in those situations. So clearly, to me, that means that probably the issue is the Falcons are getting into too many third and longs, 8 or more, right? And when I looked at the percentage of plays of their third downs that are 3rd and 8 or more, third and longs, they're 9th highest in the NFL. So too many of those instances, right? So it kind of boils down to a lot of early down struggles. Now, Ridder on early downs has not been particularly effective this year. His EPA per play on first and second down ranks 32nd out of 34 quarterbacks. So he's a bottom 3 quarterback. Now, I think some of that is owed to sacks being counted as part of EPA, but I'm not 100% sold on that. Depending on what website you go to, it might factor in differently. But clearly, Ridder needs to get better on those early downs. But what stands out is the Falcons have given up 9 sacks on first and second down this year on 69 dropbacks. Not nice, right? That's the highest sack rate in the NFL. That's 2.5 times higher than the league average in those instances. And 6 out of those 9 sacks came against the Lions. So we have another root cause of what derailed the Falcons against the Lions. They had far too many breakdowns, especially on early downs against the Lions, that put them in third and unmanageables for their young quarterback. And so I know, everybody gets into the civil war, blaming the quarterback, blaming the offensive line, blaming whatever, right? Wanting to point one finger at it. But quarterback needs to play better, but at the same time, right, the offensive line needs to play better. Now, offensive line isn't to blame for Ridder missing those throws at the beginning of the fourth quarter, right? But I don't think you can expect your young, still developing quarterback to thrive in an environment where there's so many negative plays on early downs where he's stuck having to bail the team out on 3rd and 10 or 3rd and 14. Now, to Ridder's credit, he made a big time throw in the fourth quarter to Mac Hollins on 3rd and 14. That was a great throw, probably the best throw he had of the game. But I don't want Desmond Ridder to have to do that every single week, right? If we had Justin Herbert, if we had Patrick Mahomes, I would expect that out of those guys. I'm not expecting that out of Desmond Ridder. Now, maybe there's a future. And again, those flashes that we saw in weeks 1 and 2, and then on that one play against the Lions in the fourth quarter, like that gives us hope that, okay, with time, with development, he can be more consistently able to do those things, but he shouldn't be asked to do those things at this point in his career. So the rest of this team needs to step up and do better by Desmond Ridder, just like he also needs to step up and make the throws when they're there, right? And I think especially the offensive line needs to step up. Now, we spent the last year, talking about the incredible job that Dwayne Ledford has done, and I have this whole stockpile of Dwayne Ledford stock. But now I'm sitting here going like, do I have to start selling my Dwayne Ledford stock, right? And, I recall going into the season, getting in some arguments with people on Twitter about, the differences between the Falcons offensive line and the Panthers offensive line. The Panthers offensive line has been pretty bad, abysmal this year. But has the Falcons offensive line been really any better, right? I know those people, at least that were arguing with me, were insisting that the Falcons had a top 5, top 10 type of offensive line. Have you seen that type of unit this year, right? So when I talk about expectations, I sit here and I go, like, did you have expectations that Desmond Ridder was going to be a top 10 quarterback? I didn't. I don't think many of you guys did. So the fact that Desmond Ridder doesn't look like one of those guys isn't a huge disappointment to me. Now, did you have expectations that the Falcons would have a top 10 offensive line? I think a lot of us did. And so when I ask you what's a bigger disappointment, the quarterback or the offensive line, it's clearly, to me, the offensive line. So we'll leave that conversation there. We'll continue today's episode talking about why I did not have as many issues with the game plan. We'll go through the first, 18 plays of the game and talk about why, to me, the game plan and play calling was at least to me, a non-issue against the Detroit Lions. And we'll continue that on today's Locked On Falcons. So our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Football host Vinny Iyer to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each and every week, all season long. And whether you're prepping for a daily draft or scouring the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide you with players that are guaranteed fit to fit your roster. So with draft prep underway, let's see who Vinny has picked out for us for this week's eBay's Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week. And, much to my chagrin, Vinny has Calvin Ridley, Jaguars wide receiver, who's due for a classic rebound and revenge opportunity in London in week 4 against his former team, the Atlanta Falcons, right? And Ridley's been pretty quiet since week 1, right? Their passing game, Jacksonville's that is, has slumped the last 2 weeks. And maybe he gets back to returning to form now that he's a little bit more motivated this week against the Falcons. And we'll see if the Jaguars do a better job scheming him open across the pond and make him that massive target volume for Trevor Lawrence to count big time again. Now that Vinny Iyer of Locked On Fantasy Football has helped us win our fantasy championships, eBay Motors knows that a championship team is about each player being a perfect fit. And the same is true with your vehicle. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly, whether it's air filters, brakes, batteries, taillights, alternated shock struts, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the very first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash, baby. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers, eligible items only, exclusions apply. So, looking at some of the comments on the videos over the last couple of days and some of the feedback I got from some of you guys, a lot of you guys thought the game plan and the play calling was very questionable. Now, as I've said over the last couple of days, I didn't have major issues with that, and watching the film didn't really have issues with it. So we'll talk about why I didn't, right? I had much bigger issues with Arthur Smith's play calling last week against the Packers, right? We talked about some of the questionable red zone calls in that game. And while I didn't mention it in that episode, because at the time I felt like it was kind of nitpicky, I didn't love the fact that they called the same exact play on the 4th and 1 at the end of the game that they called earlier in the game on the 4th and 1, right? Like the main reason you converted that the second time was because Blue Magic, like Green Bay saw it coming. And like that to me is bad process, favorable, good result. That's kind of how I felt about it. But when it comes to the criticism of play calling, I think a lot of it stems from, I think play calling often is an easy scapegoat for why a play didn't work, right? It's the play caller messed up, right? Because, any given play is based off of 22 different variables, the 22 players, doing or not doing their jobs. But it's a lot easier to focus on the one variable, the play caller, than it is those 22 individual variables that affect the outcome of a play. I think the other reason why play calling gets a lot more grief than it deserves is I think the heightened emotions of game day, prompt people to overreact in the moment. And I fall into this trap myself from time to time. Is why I constantly tell you, I'm going to reserve judgment until I watch the film, right? But 99% of fans don't rewatch the games, right? And so they never get that sort of reset, right? And so the emotions of game day kind of linger for days, weeks, months, and sometimes years, right? That's why you got to go to therapy. But, I think when I look at it, I think it tends to be overrated because, in any given game, you're going to have roughly 60 or so plays. And even if you're like 5 of them were bad play calls, if you had a 65 question quiz and you missed 5 of them, you'd still get an A on that quiz. And so I tend to think that play calling gets a lot more grief than it deserves. But let's go to the first 15 and 20 plays that's illustrate why I didn't have a problem with it and why the first 15 and 20 plays, because those are the scripted plays, right? That's the plays that typically the play caller has a little bit more control. After that point, it's really about adjustments, and the score and situation indicates the play. And I'm sure some of you are like, well, they failed to make adjustments. Again, I think most of the Falcons' problems were poor execution. So it wasn't that they failed to adjust. Their adjustments didn't work, just like the things that they planned to do going into the game didn't work. But let's look at the first 18 plays of the game. The first play was a screen to Bijan Robinson, right? And why have the Falcons called screens on the first plays of each of the last 2 weeks? Because they know their quarterback tends to start slow and they're trying to get him into a rhythm. So no problem with that play caller. Second play, they call a rollout. Aiden Hutchinson tips that pass as Ridder tries to throw it to Mac Hollins over the middle. But you watch the film and you're like, Drake London's wide open in the flat and Ridder doesn't throw the ball. So I don't have a problem with that play call. It's just quarterback didn't execute it. The third down, you run a pass to Algier in the flat. I could nitpick it and say, like, maybe you run that to Bijan, he makes it. But, like, I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, my God, terrible play call to run a play to Tyler Algier, right? It's not like we're running plays for Carlos Washington over Bijan Robinson. We're running it to Tyler Algier. No offense, Carlos Washington, but you guys get what I'm saying. So that's the first series, 3 and out. Second series starts. They run the ball to Tyler Algier. Again, same thing. Not going to sit here and gripe about Tyler Algier getting carries, right? Even if I would prefer Bijan to get them. Then you run a deep shot to Kyle Pitts, right? I'm not going to gripe about the Falcons taking a shot play. Ridder just missed the throw. And I had another listener that asked me, was that a Ridder miss? Was that Pitts pulling up? I count that as a Ridder miss. I know we saw the replay of Pitts kind of hobbling on that play. And, I'm not going to read too much into that. I know other people are questioning Pitt's effort and his motivation and his commitment and all that stuff. And I think that's the heightened emotions of game day, getting people to overreact to certain things. So we're 5 plays in, and my biggest gripes are, maybe you run a few more plays to Bijan instead of Algier, and the 2 incompletions are really on the quarterback, not really the play caller. So Ridder redeems himself on the next play by hitting Drake London on that 28-yard play on third down. Then you have a first down and you have a design quarterback read option to Desmond Ridder. And again, he pulls the ball out of Bijan's hands. Again, personally, I would just hand the ball off to Bijan, but at the same time, we talked last week about how the quarterback run game was so instrumental in Ridder, figuring it out and getting into rhythm late in the game. And, I don't begrudge Arthur Smith for saying, like, hey, let's give the Lions something else to think about with the quarterback run game. He gets 2 yards, so they kind of scrap it from that point on, right? Then play 8-9, second down sack, third down sack, offensive line, right? Then you get to the third series, play 10. Now you start with the Bijan run. You get 11 yards, and everybody's like, oh, my God, this is what we should have been doing from the jump. Then you run again to Bijan. You only get 2 yards on first down. Then you go pass on second and long. You hit Pitts on the slant. Not complaining about that. Another first down run to Bijan. You lose 2 yards thanks to Brian Branch. Another pass to Pitt over the middle on the second and long. And then you run a play action and you hit Jonnu Smith on the throwback. Now your quarterback is starting to get in a rhythm. He's hit a couple of throws in a row. He seems like he's in the money. So you go back to running the football to Algier. He loses his yard there. Then you try to dial up a easy completion on second and long screen to Jonnu Smith. You lose 3 yards there. And then on 3rd and 14, Brian Branch breaks up the pass to Drake London on the slant, and now you kick the long field goal. So, again, I could sit here and nitpick. Maybe Bijan gets a few more touches a little bit earlier, but clearly the overriding plan, at least as I see it, was trying to work to get Ridder into a rhythm. He missed a couple of throws, but eventually he started to get going, and then you tried to establish the run, and all of a sudden it derailed the offense. So I don't get where the bad game plan, bad play calling is, right? I feel like that's nitpicking. I feel like that's overreacting in the moment. But, hey, if you have differing opinions, leave us a comment. Tell me specifically what calls you had a problem with. I'm more than happy to respond to you guys in that one. But for me, that's just me explaining why I don't think play calling was an issue against the Lions, right? Now, I'm not going to certainly paint this broad brush and tell you that Arthur Smith's play calling has been brilliant this year. But in this game specifically, I don't think it was an issue. Now, most of my issues with Arthur Smith from a play calling standpoint are more philosophical than the specific play calls, right? My philosophical issues are like, Arthur Smith, why are you allergic to speed, right? That's a philosophical issue. But in terms of how he applies his specific flavor of offense, which we talked about on yesterday's episode, no major issues with that. So there may be games in the future where I'm going to have specific issues with Arthur Smith's play calling, but not this week. So that's going to leave the play calling issue aside, and we'll wrap up today's episode talking about the Falcons defense, the ability to get pressure, and the unveiling of the dime defense, and whether or not Troy Andersen's injury is going to derail that plan moving forward. And we'll get into all that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, I want to tell you guys about Jace Medical, who provides the Jace case, which includes 5 life-saving antibiotics for emergency use. And why do you need to stock up on antibiotics? Well, we live in a hectic world, guys, right? You never know when the next supply chain shortages or natural disasters or pandemics going to hit, and you don't want to get stuck without access to life-saving medications. So it doesn't hurt to be more prepared now than ever. And I deal with sinus infections, ear infections, so having that Jace case, the getting access to those antibiotics is great and easy and simple for me. You just got to fill out a simple online form, get those potential life-saving medications sent right to your door, and everyone should be empowered to care for themselves and their loved ones during the unexpected. And you can save more than $360 by getting these life-saving antibiotics with Jace Medical. Plus, you get an additional $20 off by using the code LOCKEDON at checkout at jasemedical.com. It's JASE medical.com, promo code locked on. So after the game, we talked about how the pass rush took a step forward this week. And they certainly had their moments, particularly the latter half of the second quarter, the latter half of the third quarter. We saw the pass rush get after the quarterback. But overall, when charting the defense, it was a pretty meh game for the Falcons pass rush, right? I charted the Falcons getting pressure on 12 of Jared Goff's 34 dropbacks. That's a 35% pressure rate, which is right at the acceptable level that you've heard me time and time again mention, that 35% rate. But the Falcons try to rely heavily on their 4-man rush for much of this part of this game, and it wasn't that effective, right? I charted 7 blitzes in this game. PFF had 8, and the Lions picked that apart. I know PFF graded Jared Goff with a 90 passing grade against the Falcons blitz. I charted a 71% success rate against those blitz, so that's an extremely high success rate. Now, when the Falcons weren't blitzing, they weren't getting that much pressure, right? When I take out the blitzes, their pressure rate when just rushing forward drops to 30%, which is that unacceptable number. Now, the other thing notable charting the game was the Falcons played a lot more zone in this game. I charted 59% zone in this game after the first 2 games where the Falcons were in 64% man coverage. Now, they basically scrapped the man coverage at halftime. Right. And my best guess to why is basically Amon-Ra St. Brown was kind of killing them in man coverage. Like 5 out of his 6 targets in the first half were against man coverage. He caught all 5 of those. The Falcons really didn't have anybody that can cover him. Few teams do. For those that don't know, Amon-Ra St. Brown, looking at PFF's yards per route run metric, which I think is probably the most definitive wide receiver stat out there. He was tied with Cooper Kupp and Stephon Diggs in the top 7 last year in that metric. In 2022. And there was a play in the second quarter where the Falcons tried to put AJ Terrell on him in the slot, and Amon-Ra beat him pretty easily. And that was our best punch. We put our best player on him. We couldn't stop him. So in the second half, they basically scrapped the zone, and he continued to feast in the second half as well. So, I think until the Falcons can get more reliable pressure without having to rely on the blitz, it's going to lead to this defense not being able to reach their true ceiling, right? In terms of they can be a competent defense. They've reached a level of competency, but until they can get consistent and reliable pressure, I don't know if we can call this a good defense, right? Now, the good thing about this defense is they continue to get stops in the red zone. They're currently tied for 11th in the NFL there, right? They create turnovers at a capable rate, right? They're 16th in the NFL there in terms of turnovers. And they've been pretty good on third downs this year, right? They're 10th in the NFL currently in third downs allowed this year. And they unveiled a interesting look this week on third downs. They unveiled their, one aspect of their dime defense, which was their Ruby package. Now, this they've used it sporadically in the first 2 games, but they really went hard on it in this Lions game, right? And the Ruby, and it's also referred to as dollar dime defense, is the 3-2-6, right? All dime is 6 defensive backs, but typical your classic dime is 4 down linemen, 1 linebacker, and the Falcons have 3 down linemen and 2 linebackers. Now, I'm going to refer to it as Ruby just because, and I know other people refer to it as dollar, but a couple of years ago, the Packers had a defense that had 7 defensive backs, and they called it dollar. And so that was kind of my first introduction to dollar. So I kind of reserved dollar for that type of defense, right? And so I'm just going to call it Ruby, but eventually, we just might call it dime because that's the de jour flavor of dime defense that the Falcons use, and we don't necessarily have to distinguish it between dime, but specifically we'll call it the Ruby defense. And then that's why you saw an uptick in snaps for Jalen Hawkins this week, because they were consistently using their Ruby defense on third downs, right? On 8 of the 10 third downs that the Lions threw the ball, the Falcons were in their Ruby defense. The 2 exceptions were in the red zone. And so when you look outside the red zone and you look at the other third downs where it wasn't a relatively obvious run situation like 3rd and 1 or at the end of the game when the Lions are running out the clock, the Falcons were in their Ruby defense 9 out of 9 times that you would expect them to be. Now, what's going to be interesting is how often are the Falcons going to use this now that Troy Andersen's done for the year, right? Because again, traditional dime, you have one linebacker on the field, but the Falcons have 2. And do the Falcons decide to keep doing this with now Caden Ellis and Nate Landman? Now, Nate Landman, we saw it last week against the Packers, and we saw at the end of this game when he came in for the final snaps, I think like 5 snaps for an injured Troy Andersen against the Lions. He's been an impact run defender. But while he hasn't been a liability in coverage, he's much less tested in that arena. And what was notable about the Ruby defense is that the 3 down linemen and the 4th rusher in that situation was pretty consistently Caden Ellis. And they were dropping Troy Andersen and rushing Caden Ellis. And this was something that we talked about in the offseason, is why, you valued Caden Ellis and why he could be an impactful pass rusher in these situations, because he'd get a lot more pass rushing opportunities, with Troy Andersen being more of the coverage guy. And do you still do that now that Nate Landman's subbing in for Troy Andersen? Do you feel as comfortable with Nate Landman doing the coverage things that Troy Andersen was able to do and still rushing Caden Ellis? Or do you still play the Ruby and have Nate Landman rush and drop Caden Ellis because you feel more comfortable with him doing that? I don't know. So, they unveiled this new look defense, against the Lions, and maybe they immediately scrap it moving forward. And like, well, I guess we'll just go back to traditional nickel or more traditional dime with only one linebacker. We'll sort of have to see, but that's going to be something we're going to keep an eye on. Really appreciate you guys for tuning in for another All-22 review. For the subtext subscribers, you guys will get an extended All-22 review, and you'll probably get a more in-depth look into those first 18 plays, in terms of what I saw and some of the good from Desmond Ridder as well on that subtext. And if you don't know what subtext is, it's basically a way that you guys can text me and you get updates from me. You can get one-on-one conversations and all that, but also, part of the perks that we're going to give for those people that subscribe to subtext is you get an extended All-22 review, and you also get priority on your questions, on future mailbags and Q&As and all that sort of stuff. So if you want to sign up, just hit the link in the description below. It's $4.99 a month, but the beauty is you get the first 14 days free. And so if you just sign up just for the extended All-22 reviews, you're basically getting those for like $1.25. Would you be willing to pay for, 30 minutes, which is what has been the case the last 2 weeks, of extra film breakdowns, an exclusive for that? Would you pay $1.25 for 30 more minutes of film breakdowns? And again, you only have to pay, get the first 2 weeks free. So you're only really paying, $2 for that. But I think it's worth it. But, you decide. Hit the link in the description below. Of course, the link in the description below is also the link to the Discord where you can submit questions. You can also email me at lockdownfalcons@mail.com. And, when I'm on Twitter, you can hit me up at lockdownfalcons there as well. So that is going to do it for us here, guys. Tomorrow we will be back with a crossover Thursday, talking with Locked On Jaguars host Tony Wiggins, to break down this London matchup, and hopefully Calvin Ridley won't wreck us. So that's the hope, that's the dream. Hopefully the offensive line is going to step up, the quarterback's going to step up. To me, the thing I'm going to be looking forward to, I can already tell you, sort of, how do the Falcons respond to the adversity they face against the Lions? They got punched in the mouth, as Drake London said. Are they going to be punching back, or are they going to lay down? So that's going to be the big topic this weekend. So we'll find out. We'll break it down on tomorrow's episode. Continue to check out Locked On Falcons as your first listen. And of course, for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL podcast. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.